G'day and welcome to another episode of Masterclass Working Sheepdog Training. My name's Tully Williams and today I'll explain the 12 most important keys to success with sheepdogs. And these 12 keys are what I've learned over the past 35 years training literally hundreds and hundreds of my own sheepdogs and helping hundreds of clients train theirs. And this episode is really a big picture overview. All of the points discussed have other episodes devoted to exploring all of these aspects in much greater detail. So the first essential to achieving success with sheepdogs is the sheepdog itself. There's an old saying that you can't make a silk purse out of a sow's ear. And when it comes to sheepdogs, this is extremely true. Many beginners incorrectly think that any dog of a sheepdog breed, for example a border collie or a kelpie, or even some non-traditional working breeds, can be trained to be sheepdogs. And this simply isn't true. And it's a lesson that I learned very quickly when I first started training sheepdogs when I was 12 years old. My first pup was a free-to-good-home border collie kelpie cross. And I didn't realise it at the time, but although he was very keen, he had very little natural ability. And that combination of a beginner and a poor quality pup was a recipe for failure. I just couldn't get anything to work particularly well at all. Also, I didn't understand any of the other points that I will cover in this episode. Now, my second pup a year or so later was at the opposite end of the spectrum, an extremely well-bred border collie pup that I purchased with loads of natural ability. And the difference was amazing. And this was the start of my fascination with breeding sheepdogs and with all the inherited instincts that are necessary to make a good dog. Often beginners think that they don't really need a real champion, but the reality is that particularly when you're a beginner, you need all the help you can get. And the better the pup is, not only will the training be much easier, but it'll also be much more enjoyable. Many budding sheepdog trainers give up because training second-rate dogs often simply is just too hard and not particularly enjoyable. So that's the first key to success. Purchase a good quality pup right at the start. And if you'd like to learn more about exactly what to look for when buying a pup, then you can check out my book or the DVD Natural Ability for much more information. The second key to success, once you've hopefully found yourself a good quality pup, is some decent facilities to train in. When I attempted to train my first pup, not only didn't he have much natural ability, but I was also attempting to train out in an open paddock. And as you can imagine, it was chaos. Initially, you will want a small sheep and dog proof yard to train in. Even better if you have a few different sizes, and then some small paddocks and then some larger paddocks. You can check out the video episode about the facilities you'll need and how to set them up fairly cheaply and easily if you don't have them to learn more about this. But without some reasonable facilities, you will have a lot of trouble. The third vital key to successful sheepdog training is having suitable livestock to train on. Sheep are generally the best option, even if you're training a dog to ultimately work cattle or goats. We want sheep that are used to being worked by good dogs and that have suitable temperaments. If the sheep are too aggressive, then they can attack the pup and put them off working altogether. If they're too wild or flighty, they can be too difficult for the pup to control. We want sheep that are calm and relaxed and quiet. And without these suitable sheep, particularly with a novice handler, you will have a lot of trouble training your pup. And you can train on other livestock also. I trained my first dog mainly on 2 ducks, but sheep are generally the best option. So, once we have the first 3 keys to success taken care of, with our well-bred pup, some suitable facilities and some suitable livestock, the next essential is that our pup is keen. That is, that it's interested and actually wants to work the sheep. And some pups are very keen at a young age. Others take a long time to get interested, and some may only ever be half-hearted or may never show any particular interest at all. And without sustained interest, we can't really train a dog successfully. Most dogs will chase sheep to a certain extent, but many lack that sustained keenness to the point of obsession that a sheepdog requires. And with young pups, we simply give them a free run on some free moving sheep until that keenness has developed. I'll do an episode on this in the future. But once our pup is keen, we then have to be careful to maintain that keenness. We have to balance training our pup and achieving obedience, while keeping it interested and having fun. This is where some beginners, particularly those with a background in more traditional dog obedience, often go wrong. They start out trying to have perfect control right from the beginning, and the dog simply loses interest because working sheep isn't much fun. When training sheepdogs, we have to prioritise keenness above anything else. So be careful you don't do anything to dampen that enthusiasm. Once it's lost, it can be very hard to get back. And with some pups, it can be surprisingly easy to smother their interest. The next point is that the commands you use will have a significant impact on how easy and how successful your training will be. Most people simply pick up commands they've heard others use without any real thought or design. On the other hand, a well-designed commanding system means our dog learns faster because the commands don't overlap or contradict other commands, and the end results are much better. The commanding system I use, which was developed largely by Rod Kavanagh, I believe is superior to any other commanding system I've ever come across. And I've made some slight changes to this system over the years because I've found that even slight improvements can result in drastic changes to how fast the dogs learn, simply because our system of communication has become clearer. And I can't emphasise enough how much difference a good commanding system makes. In fact, I consider a good commanding system to be money for nothing. Just by using better commands, you will get better results without making any other improvements to your training ability or methods. And taking the time to understand a good commanding system is time well spent. When I teach sheepdog training schools, particularly to groups of farmers, one of the initial exercises I do is to give them all a piece of paper and a pen and ask them to write down their commands. Even just at this point, there's generally a lot of head scratching going on, which is a valuable lesson in itself. And then I take their answers, ask them questions such as, what does this command mean? What do you expect your dog to do? And once again, there's generally a lot of umming and ahhing and head scratching as they try to figure out what their commands actually mean. And they soon get the idea that if they aren't clear on what their commands mean, then what hope has the dog got? Often just straightening their commands out a bit without doing any extra training of their dog drastically improves their dog's performance. Now, broadly speaking, I divide commanding systems up into three categories. Firstly, no system at all, where people's commands have just evolved with no real thought or design. Secondly, simple commanding systems with only a small number of commands. And thirdly, comprehensive commanding systems. And there's a full discussion on the pros and cons of simple versus comprehensive commanding systems in another episode. But whatever you do, make sure you make an informed decision and use a well-designed commanding system. Everything will work much better. So with the first 5 points under control, we have our well-bred pup, some suitable facilities and livestock, it's nice and keen to work, and we've chosen a good commanding system. The next factor is the methods that we're going to use to train it. And there's a lot of different methods of training around. And by methods, I don't mean whether we are using positive reinforcement or negative reinforcement based methods. You simply can't train animals or people exclusively with positive reinforcement based methods. Anyone who says otherwise has no idea what they're talking about. And if you want to learn more about this, then my book, Real World Dog Training, comprehensively discusses this subject. But what I'm talking about here is the methods of teaching various things. For example, when teaching a dog to cast, there's a whole range of different approaches we could take. And some will suit some dogs better than others, and some will depend on what facilities we have, and some will simply work better or worse than other methods. The better methods we use, the quicker and easier and better results we will achieve. And one of the biggest mistakes I see beginners making is going to sheepdog training school after sheepdog training school with every different trainer around and constantly changing methods based on the latest fad. And this often just ends up completely confusing the dog and also completely confusing the new handler. I suggest finding a method that appeals to you and basically sticking with it until you're a bit more experienced before you start trying various other approaches. Over the years, I've experimented with all sorts of different methods on all sorts of different dogs in all sorts of different conditions. I've trained dogs on farms I've worked on with not much in the way of facilities at all, and I've trained with good facilities. And I've found which methods work and which don't, and with which dogs. And I've found which work faster and easier and more effectively. All the methods I teach throughout this series have been extensively tested, and I've found them to get the best results in the quickest and easiest fashion. So that's point 6. Make sure you're using good methods of training. For more information, check out the episode on principles versus methods. Point number 7 is that we should be careful not to allow bad habits to form. Once bad habits start, they're exponentially more difficult to cure than if they aren't allowed to begin in the first place. For example, once your dog learns to enjoy chasing other wildlife, like kangaroos or rabbits, or learns to go and find sheep on its own to work, or it learns it can ignore you at a distance, these problems get harder to fix. I remember working on a big merino sheep property years ago, and the boss and I were out mustering a mob of about 1,000 ewes with their lambs into a set of outyards to mark the lambs. And he had a couple of dogs and I had a couple. It was pretty hilly, broken sort of country with lots of rocks and timber. Anyhow, we had the mob almost to the sheep yards when a dozen or so kangaroos came hopping through the mob from our side, right through the middle, and took off on the other side. And the boss's dogs took off after the kangaroos, right through the middle of the mob as well, and disappeared out of sight. And we had sheep down in the gullies on one side and up on a rocky ridge on the other side and split up all over the place. So the boss and I and my 2 dogs put all the sheep back together and just about had them to the yards again when his dogs returned, this time coming straight through the middle of the mob from the far side to get back to us. And once again we had sheep scattered all over the place. And the boss would sometimes have to go looking for his dogs for hours when they would take off after kangaroos like this. And yet my dogs hardly even looked at the kangaroos. I had simply never allowed them to get into these bad habits because I'd never taken them out to work until they were well under control, and I hadn't given them more freedom than they were ready for. So the moral of the story is that preventing bad habits generally comes down to not putting dogs into positions they're not ready for. So that's point number 7. It's much easier to be careful and prevent bad habits from starting than it is to fix them. This next point is related to the previous point. All of our training should be progressive. We should train one step at a time and not skip steps. If you're impatient and skip steps, you'll simply allow bad habits to form, and your training will slow down drastically. Often people ask, how do they know when the pup's ready for more challenging situations? For example, to be allowed to work in bigger paddocks and so on. And the answer is that you should have pretty close to perfection in a smaller area or earlier stage of training before you move to a bigger area or more challenging stage. If you don't have great control of your dog in a small sheep yard, you're not ready to move into a bigger one. But on the other hand, many handlers stay at an earlier stage of training for too long and end up simply wasting a lot of time. We should keep progressing in our training. Doing the same thing over and over again with no progress is simply pointless. Often people come to me for lessons who have trained with other trainers, and they sometimes have spent a year or more in a small round yard and have hardly taught the pup any commands or anything in all that time. And this is just pointless. We don't want to progress too fast, but we also don't want to waste time doing nothing particularly productive. So make sure your training's progressive, but keep moving along. The final 4 points are relevant no matter what method you choose to use. While there are many different methods, the principles of training never change. And the better you follow these principles, the better results you'll get. The first of these points is that no matter what method you use, you have to be in the right position to implement them, particularly during the dog's early training on sheep. And I call this position either the position of control or the position of influence. All beginner handlers struggle initially with being out of position, and so they can't train their dogs effectively no matter what methods they're trying to use. And the two biggest secrets of this are to stay close to the sheep and close to the dog, with the priority being to stay close to the sheep. Then, whenever you need more control or influence, get yourself directly between the sheep and the dog. And that's just a very quick summary, but this aspect is covered extensively in the episode on the handler's position, and is one of the most important lessons beginner or even intermediate handlers need to learn. You have to be in the right position in relation to the sheep and the dog in order to train it effectively. The second point in relation to principles of training is that you should always strive to give a command before you then cause the dog to respond the way you want it to. And I describe this as command, then cause. Now, nearly all beginners and even various big name trainers in fact do and teach the exact opposite. They create the behaviour first and then give the command. This is completely backwards, and the dog will learn absolutely nothing. And this isn't optional. It isn't a matter of just a different method or a different way of doing things. It simply will not work. There's an entire episode just on this subject. And if you get this right, your training will be far quicker and easier and more effective. So that's point number 10. If we want our dog to learn commands, we have to command first and then cause. The next point, after the importance of getting into the right position in order to effectively train your dog, and that you should always give a command before causing the dog to respond, is how to use praise. Used correctly, the strategic use of praise will help your dog learn much more quickly and easily. If we use praise too much or in the wrong way, we can either simply turn it into background noise that the dog ignores, or even just make our training less effective. Once again, there's an entire episode devoted to mastering the use of praise in order to make our training the most effective. And finally, the last point is to learn to apply the iceberg principle to all your training. And this 5-step process I developed a few years ago encapsulates and describes the principles of training any animal with pressure release type training, which is what so much of sheepdog training is based on. ICE-PERP stands for instant, continuous, escalating pressure, then immediate release and praise. And beginners, and even many more experienced handlers, usually fail in all 5 areas of this process. And there's an entire video devoted to this. If you can truly understand and then apply this process, you'll be miles ahead of the majority of sheepdog trainers. So the final point is to take the time to really understand and then apply the iceberg process. So these are the 12 keys to success with sheepdog training. And pay attention to these main areas and you'll set yourself up for success right from the start. Do your best to obtain a high quality pup. Get access to some suitable facilities and sheep to train on. Foster your pup's keenness and be careful not to dampen their enthusiasm. Use a good, well-designed commanding system. Follow good methods of training. Be careful not to allow your pup to get into bad habits by giving it too much freedom that it just isn't ready for. Make sure you train your pup step by step. Don't skip steps, but also make sure you keep progressing. Learn and understand the position of control or position of influence so that you can be in the right place to train your pup effectively. Understand the importance of commanding first and then causing your dog to respond. Learn how to use praise effectively. And finally, really learn and understand the iceberg process that is essential if you're going to become a good handler. So understand and then apply these 12 steps and you'll greatly accelerate your sheepdog training journey. See you next time.